Okay, so in today's demonstration, we are still exploring Adobe Animate. So on Tuesday, we looked at the drawing modes. We explored how to use some of the drawing tools in Animate. We explored things like the selection tool, the free transform tool. We worked with some of these basic shape creation tools here. We didn't explore the pen tool or anything like that just yet. We'll also explore the paintbrush tool, but we'll do that in next week's demonstration. That's when we'll wrap up everything for this unit and you guys can get started on your first assignment. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to start with the file that we ended with on Tuesday. So I can see that my screen's not on. Sorry about that. Okay, so now everybody can see the screen on the wall behind me. So we're going to start with the file that we ended with on Tuesday. And the things that we covered on Tuesday with regard to actually animating and creating a frame-by-frame animation was we created the movement of the ball by creating these keyframes in the timeline. So with each keyframe, as I click on these one by one, you can see that it denotes, each keyframe notes change in that object, specifically the location of that object. And so this is just like in Photoshop when we were working with the timeline in Photoshop and you had a frame for the sequential movement of an object in those frames. This is the exact same kind of concept. So each of these keyframes is showing this object moving in increments. So I have it kind of arcing like this. So this is just very basic frame-by-frame animation. When I scrub through, you can see this nice, smooth kind of transition. Now, what we're going to do today is we're also going to add sound to our animation, and we're going to animate this in a different way. So what I walked you through on Tuesday, we're going to get rid of in the timeline. And this is an important thing to know how to do because there are times when you will want to delete content from the timeline. And this is a good opportunity to explain to you how menus work in this program. So you have two different edit menus in Animate. And this is something that you really want to try and commit to memory. It's very important. You'll be very confused if you forget this. We are used to just like when we want to copy and paste something, we're used to just selecting it and hitting Command C, Command V to copy and paste. And you can also do that from the edit menu at the top of the window. Well, this will work fine for some things. But when you're working with a timeline, you will want to use the timeline's own editing menu, which is separate and different from the main editing menu for the program and for what you see on the stage. So usually what you see on the stage, or if you're wanting to edit something on the stage, you can go through this menu and make these kinds of changes, cut, copy, paste, and all that. But if you're wanting to remove frames for animating, then you'll have to access the timeline's own edit menu. And so you'll do that by Control or right-clicking on the timeline, and now you will see a very specific menu for the timeline. And notice everything has to do with tweens and frames, so it all has to do with the timeline itself. Now, I want to actually redo this animation. So instead of having it bounce and making this arcing kind of movement, I want the ball to drop from above the stage, drop all the way to the bottom, and then I want it to bounce back up to the top of the stage again. So the things that we're also going to add sound to this. So in today's demonstration, we're going to explore several things. We're going to explore how to add sound to our animation and have it sync with the visual events of the animation. We're also going to animate some of the visible properties of our object. So we're going to have a shadow on the ground. We'll be creating another layer for this element, and it's going to serve as the shadow. And so as the ball rises up to the top of the stage, the shadow on the floor or the ground will become a lighter gray. And then as the ball bounces or falls closer to the ground, that shadow is going to get darker. So that's just what happens in real life. When objects get closer to their to a surface, the shadows that they cast are darker. When they move further away, they get a lot lighter. So we're going to learn how to animate in opacity. We're also going to apply some properties of physics to our bouncing ball. So when the ball hits the ground, we're going to animate the ball's transformation, which means we're going to scale it in a way that distorts it. So we're not going to scale it to be larger or smaller and keeping the proportions the same, but we're going to scale it by squashing it a little bit. And then as the ball springs back up off the ground, we're going to reverse that transformation back to a full circle, and then the ball is going to go back up to the top of the stage. I'm also going to show you how you can copy and paste frames in the timeline, because I want you all to have a ball that drops and bounces and pops back up and drops back down and bounces back up twice. And instead of animating those steps over and over, painstakingly keyframe by keyframe, we can cut out some of the heavy lifting just by using what we already have and recycling that animation. And so that will require us to select keyframes in the timeline, copy those keyframes, paste them where we want them to go, and we'll probably even have to reverse the order so that we have the ball moving in the opposite direction when it moves back up the stage. So to get started with today's demonstration, let's go ahead and get rid of all of our keyframes that we already have in our animation. So to do this, I'm going to select all keyframes but the first one. So to select all of these as a group, I'm going to start, either at the end or the second keyframe. I'll hold the Shift key down. So that's kind of like the universal command for selecting more than one object, pretty much in any program that you're in. And then I'll select the second keyframe. And now you can see that all of my keyframes are highlighted blue, except for the first one, which I want to keep. So when these are all highlighted blue, that lets you know that they're all selected. And now we're going to clear these keyframes. So to do that, we want to access the Timeline's editing menu. And we're going to do that by anywhere inside of this selected area, place your cursor, and you can right click if you're using a mouse, or you can press the Control key, hold it down, and then click with the mouse to bring up the special menu. And what we want to look for is not cut frames, but we want to clear keyframes. All right. Another way to do it, to really clean it up, let me undo this. So Command Z will undo. I'm going to do this another way. Control click. And this time I'm looking for remove frames. And what that does is it clears out all of the frames. Because what we were left with the other way, let me just take it back the other way. If I clear keyframes, it clears the keyframes, but it leaves the regular frames behind, which is not a huge deal. But what I wanted to point out is I was saying on Tuesday that there are 3 different types of frames that we're going to be working with in Animate. Keyframes, which always denote the presence of a visual element on that layer. And then we have what's called blank keyframes, where that element is no longer visible on that layer for a certain period of time. Or we have frames, which are these light grayed out areas across the frame. And what that does is that allows content to be visible. So if I wanted this ball to just sit here in the same spot and be visible throughout a composition or an animation, then I would have a keyframe showing that the object is present and it's visible. And if it's not animated or doing anything, but it's just visible, then you see that noted in the timeline with these light gray frames. So I just refer to those as frames or regular frames. Okay, so we've got keyframes, regular frames, and then blank keyframes. But what I want is, we're doing a frame by frame animation. So again, I'm going to go back and delete just these regular frames. So whenever you're wanting to just get rid of something entirely on the timeline, you'll want to choose that remove option. So you can still select these the way you did the keyframe. So if you hold the shift key down and just select the frames that you want to remove, then once you see them all highlighted, you can right click or control click and you can remove frames. And that just takes it back to a fresh, clean slate in the timeline. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. So now, for the first step of this animation, we want to place the ball where it needs to be at the first keyframe. So I was saying earlier that I want the ball to drop from above the stage, and I want it to fall and hit the ground and then bounce back up. So for keyframe 1, we need to place that visual element at the top of our stage and probably just above it. So I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. And then I'm going to get my free transform tool. This is the tool that I'm going to be working with for moving my object, because we're going to also animate the transformation of the object shape. And this selection tool will allow us to do that. So with this tool selected, I'm going to select the ball and move it to the top of the stage. Just like that. And so when you publish one of these animations, when you export it as a standalone, video file, the only thing you'll see is what takes place in the stage area. So all of these things out to the side will not be visible. But this gray space around the stage is a very useful space. It is a great place to hold your other visual elements that might animate into the scene at some point. So you want to think about the stage as just like a stage in real life in a theater. So when you're sitting in the audience, you're sitting in those chairs and you're looking at the stage, all you see is what's going on the stage. But you're very well aware of the fact that to the sides of the stage and even above and the catwalk above, that there are people and props waiting to make their entry. And that's just where they stay until it's their turn to come in. And so that's really the way you want to think about this space around the stage, okay? So I just wanted to point that out. Now, let's start the animation process. So my first keyframe, my ball is out of sight. Now remember, hit F6, and that is going to give you a brand new keyframe. And it's basically copying and pasting this visual element exactly where it's at. But in the second keyframe, we want to change its position just a little bit. So I'm going to, with this object selected, I'm just going to drag it down just a little bit. And remember, you see that onion skin effect? That is a great little guide or a helper to let you know how far you're moving that object before you release the mouse button and let it go. So once it's placed, by releasing the mouse button, that onion skin will go away. So this is going to be its second position or location. Now I'm going to hit F6 and I'm going to move it down just a little bit more. And then I'll hit F6 and move it down just a little bit more. F6. And remember, with F6, you want to just touch that button and release it immediately. Do not hold your finger on it for too long. It will add many keyframes. It will add more than just one keyframe. I think this is a really great exercise for learning how to create a frame by frame animation, because there's so much repetition involved that I think it really helps you. I think the practice really helps you kind of understand the concept better. Okay, so my ball is almost, I would say that that's as far as I'm going to bring it down. This is where I would consider it to start to make contact with the ground. So now I'm ready to, in the next keyframe, I want to distort this object's shape a little bit. Now let me explain the proper way to scale this, okay? So observe how the scaling will work the way this object is set up right now. So if I grab the scaling handle at the top of this shape and I scale it, it's scaling to an oval like I want it to. But in real life, that ball is not going to squish from the bottom and the top in this elevated spot, but rather it's going to make impact on the ground. The base of that ball is going to stay connected to the ground. The top surface of that ball is what's going to smush down. So we need to change the scaling point or rotation point for this object. So I'm going to undo this, Command Z, and now before I scale it, I'm going to move its scaling point. So I dragged it from the center of that object and I planted it down here on the bottom of this object. And now when I grab this top scaling handle, it's going to scale from the top down, and it's going to leave the base exactly where it needs to be. You just move that circle in the center of that selected object and place it at the bottom of your shape. Yeah. Okay. So this is, you'll need to have the other tool selected. Go to the gradient tool and hold. Click and hold and get the free transform. And now select. So this gives you all of the scaling handles that you need. Now you can move that dot and sit it down here at the bottom. Select the object with the dot. Click and drag it down. Down to where my finger is. Up. Right over that black scaling handle. Just place it there. Pick it back up. Move it and place it right. That's probably good enough. Okay. And now when you grab this scaling handle, it'll scale it from the top down. Okay. Does that make sense? Yeah. How's everybody else doing? You need some help? Let me pause this really quick. Okay, so at any point during your working process, it's always a good idea to kind of test out what you got. And you can do that just by scrubbing through these frames and watching the animation. So here's the first part of our animation. Okay. Now, instead of having to create a frame-by-frame animation going in the opposite direction, we can just copy and paste these frames and reverse them. And then we'll have the reverse. So let me show you how to do that. So I'm going to select all of these keyframes by holding the Shift key down. And then I'm going to press Control-click to get the special timeline editing menu. And I'm going to choose Copy Frames. And then I'm going to go to the location where I want to paste those frames. And that's going to be right after the very last keyframe.
So copy.
Copy. Select all of your keyframes. Even that one. Select all of them. And when they're all selected, you're going to Control-click on the selected, anywhere in that selected area of those keyframes. And you're going to choose Copy Frames. And now, once I've copied these, so now I'm ready to paste them. So I want to paste them right at the end, right after my last keyframe. So I'm going to choose that frame, and then I'll Control-click and I'll choose Paste Frames. So there's my pasted frames. Now look what happens right now. So I have the ball dropping. It's going to hit the ground and squish. And then it's going to pop right back up to the top of the stage and drop back down. So what we want is the opposite direction of that ball. So instead of it looping back over to the top of the stage and dropping back down, we want it to pop back up. So we're going to go to the keyframe where we first pasted in. So for me, there's the last keyframe for where it hits the ground and squashes. The next keyframe, it pops back up into the air. So that's where I'm going to start my selection. And I'm going to grab the last keyframe where it drops back down, which is just a repeat of the other, the first part of the animation. And with all of these keyframes selected, I'm going to press Control on my keyboard or right click anywhere in these selected frames and choose Reverse Frames. And now you have a smooth bouncing up and down transition. Yes. In fact, I'm going to do it again by just copying and pasting these frames again. So I'm going to click through my timeline and find where the ball makes impact. I'm going to hold the Shift key down, grab the last keyframe. So I've just selected this group of keyframes. I'm going to Control click, copy these frames. I'm going to go to the very next frame after the last keyframe. I'll Control click again in that new or in that selected frame, and I'll choose Paste Frames. And then I'll have to reverse those again because look what I have. If I hit the play, it bounces and bounces back up, and then it loops back up to the top. And it's because I just pasted it in the original order, but I want it to do it in reverse. So it's a cleaner transition. So what I'll do is I will select the keyframes that need to be reversed. So I'll start with this keyframe where the ball is sitting at the base. I'll select the last keyframe. I'm going to Control click and reverse frames. And I'm going to do that one more time. So with these still selected, I'm going to Control click, copy frames, go to the very next frame, Control click, paste frames, and then reverse those last pasted in frames. So find where there's the discrepancy of the sequential order of movement and start your selection at that point. Hold the Shift key down, get the last keyframe. When they're all selected, right click or Control click on those selected keyframes and reverse frames. And now we should have the ball bouncing twice. You paste the frames and then you reverse the frames. Okay. Okay, so I think everybody's in a good place, hopefully. So what I have right now, again, is my bouncing ball. It does it twice. So it drops from the top of the stage down, bounces back up, and then repeats that same process. And so what we just went through was how to do that using, creating a frame-by-frame animation technique. So you can see in my timeline, I just have a sequence of keyframes, one frame right after the other. And we also animated a shape's transformation. So when the ball hits the ground and makes impact, it squishes down a little bit. And so that's good. We want it to do that. That's what it would do in real life. So those are some things that we've covered so far. Now we're going to add sound to this. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to animate a shadow for this ball bouncing. It's going to live on the ground. It's never going to move location, but its appearance is going to change. So we're going to animate the shape's opacity. And that is going to further accentuate this idea of this ball, really moving through realistic space and casting a shadow. It's just going to add to those properties of physics that you would expect, a three-dimensional bouncing ball to have. So let's get some sound in here. So we're going to import an asset into Adobe Animate. And so your properties window is probably already open. And if it is, then your library tab is probably open as well. Usually those two open together. If it's not, then go to Window and look for Library. But I see that my library tab is already up and running. And so what you see in this window right now is nothing. But let me explain to you what these two separate parts are. The library window has two windows. It has a preview window that allows you to see the content that you've imported into this program or into your document. And then below is your collection of assets. Now these could be assets that you create in Animate that you've converted to symbols, which we will talk about in the next unit. Or it can be other assets that you import in. Maybe you have a JPEG image that you want to use as a backdrop. You can do that. And when you bring it in, it will show up in this window down here. And in this case, we're going to bring sound into this document. So we're going to import the sound file. And when we do, we will see a little icon show up down here in this part of the window. And then in the preview window, you'll see a waveform and a little play button that lets you sample the sound. So to import sound into this program, you're going to go up here to File and choose Import. And you can import it to the stage or the library. I think I'll just import it to the library. And then once you do that, your file directory will open up and you will just go and find that bounce to MP3 file. You can even sample it in the preview window if you like. But once you find it, go ahead and open, and there we go. So there is our first asset that we've brought into Adobe Animate. If you click on that asset, the preview window above, now you'll see it looks quite different. It's giving us a preview of what that content is, what it consists of. Since this is sound, it's going to show us the waveform for that sound. And there's a little tiny play button up here in the corner that lets you sample it. So, very good. Now what we need to do is we need to create a place for that sound to live within our composition. So right now we have a layer that's just for the bouncing ball. And it has all these keyframes that show us the animated process for that bouncing ball. Now we're going to create another layer for sound. And so you can do that in the Layers window by clicking this plus sign, New Layer. And you can rename these layers anything you like. So, like, I'm going to go ahead and name both of my layers just so I'm practicing good file organization. So I'm going to double click on the word Layer 1, and I'm going to call this Bouncing Ball. And then Layer 2, Bounce, and I think it likes underscore. I don't think it likes spaces, but it'll tell you that, and then hit Enter. So Bounce Sound. So right now we just have a layer. It's ready to receive that sound. So now we're going to move our playhead, and we're going to scrub to the location where the ball makes impact. And that is the location where you want to create a keyframe in the sound layer. So right up above, or in my case, because my sound layer is above, the sound layer can go in any order because it's not something that you see, it's something that you hear. So it could go at the bottom of the stack in the layer order, it could go at the top, it doesn't matter. Either way, it will still play just fine. But notice that I have selected a frame in the sound layer. So you can see that it's highlighted blue here. And I'm going to create a keyframe there. All right, and I'm going to do that by hitting F6. Now, when I do that, it's really just the beginning of a keyframe, but it's technically a blank keyframe because the layer doesn't recognize any content yet. But what we're doing by placing that keyframe there, which ended up being a blank keyframe, is we are targeting a location for that sound bite to begin to play. So we don't want it to start at the beginning of our timeline because it wouldn't make sense. The ball's just dropping from the stage or from the top of the stage down. But we want it to begin where that ball makes impact with the bottom of the stage. And so we got to find that in the keyframes. And so that's just what I've done. Now I have a place for that sound to, a target place for that sound to land. So I'm going to select this keyframe. And with it selected, then I'm going to drag the bounce sound over to the stage. And you'll notice that now it starts at that keyframe that I just created. Now I'm going to hit the enter button. I'll drag my playhead to the beginning. I'm going to test this out, make sure that it is syncing up with the visual event, and hit enter. And I need it to do that twice. So what I can do is create another keyframe in that same sound layer. And I can do it right over the previous waveform. But you'll need to scrub through with the playhead and find that keyframe where the ball makes impact again. And then right up above that in the sound layer, create a keyframe. Hit F6. And now we have a keyframe. It's a blank keyframe, but it will turn into a keyframe once we add sound again. And there we go. Okay, one last thing. Let's animate a shadow. So we're going to need a layer for the shadow. So I'm going to create this layer by choosing the new layer icon. I'm going to double click on the name layer 3 and call it shadow. And I want the shadow to be really beneath the bouncing ball layer. So I'm going to just click and drag that layer to the bottom. And one thing that I'm going to do is I need this oval shape to match up with where this ball makes contact. So I'm going to drag my playhead out enough, so, or at least to the point where the ball makes contact with the ground. And then this is going to be the location where I draw the oval. That way I can gauge proximity, the closeness of the shadow to the shape, to the ball, and then the size of it as well. So once I get my playhead where I need it to kind of help me mark the space where I need to be drawing, I'm going to get the oval tool. And I'm just going to click and drag an oval. And this won't have a gradient, so I'll go ahead and just assign this a flat color. And let's just go with, oh, I need to select it first. We're going to go with black. And I accidentally drew this as a merge drawn object. You'll need to actually convert this to an object drawn object. It'll be much easier for you to see the subtle changes in opacity as we animate this. So if yours looks like mine and it's got that screen over it when you select it, let's convert it to an object drawn object. So I'm going to go to Modify and Combine and union. And that turns it into an object, drawn object. And I want this shadow to be kind of underneath this ball a little bit. I want some overlapping. So there we go. But I made it by using the ball as a guide of where it needs to be drawn, so that the ball sits on top of the shadow shape and kind of overlaps it. Makes it look a little more realistic, more believable as stacked shapes. And when I did that, this process allowed me to create what's called just regular frames, which allows this shape to be visible. So you can leave those there, or you can delete them and just begin the frame by frame animation. It's really up to you. But the main thing is that we need to get the positioning correct first. So once you get that object drawn and it's in the right position, right shape and size, now you're ready to start to animate it. So when I drag my playhead all the way back to the beginning, my first keyframe is at the beginning of the timeline. My ball is farthest away from that shape, which means that this shape is going to be a lot lighter in color. So I'm going to adjust the opacity of this shape. I'm going to do that by selecting the object. This gets a little tricky, okay? So you really have to pay attention to what's going on. The reason why is because the color sampling feature is so sensitive in this program that you could accidentally select even just the interface color and replace what's in the color fill box with that. And that's not really what you want. So if you look at the top of this menu of the swatch window, there's a setting for alpha. That means the same thing as transparency or opacity. I'm going to scrub this 100%. Let's scrub it down to let's say 10%. So this is what it's going to look like at the beginning of the animation. Then I'm going to copy and paste that content into a new keyframe by simply selecting that keyframe where I brought down the opacity. I'm going to hit F6, and then I'm going to, with that shape selected, go back to my color fill box, go back to alpha, and I'm going to increase that to 20% and hit enter. Now I'm going to go to F6 to create another keyframe, go back to my color box, go back to alpha, and I'm just typing in these percentages. So now it's going to go up to 30. Hit F6 to create another keyframe. You're just copying and pasting that shadow element into a new frame. Go back to the color fill box, go back to the alpha percentage, type in 40%. So it's getting darker and darker in 10% increments. Hit F6 to create another keyframe. Go to the color fill box, choose or type in 50 and hit enter. Hit F6, go back to the color fill box, boost that up to 60. It's going to make it darker. F6 for another keyframe. Click the alpha percentage, go to 70, hit enter. Press F6 to duplicate that keyframe. Go to the color fill box, go to the alpha percentage, choose or type in 80%, hit enter. Hit F6 to create another keyframe. Go back to the color swatch window, choose the alpha box. 90%, hit enter. And then 100%. Now, if you want to kind of slow down, like notice that it doesn't quite, like notice that mine gets to 100% before the ball actually makes impact. Here's some little tricks where you can speed up or slow down an animation in Adobe Animate. So I can create a little more space between these keyframes for the shadow just by selecting these keyframes except for the first one. And when they're selected, just slide them down a frame or two. And then go on to the next set of keyframes, slide those down a frame or two, the next set of keyframes, What do you mean?
Like the circle.
Yes, the shadow is on its own layer. Yep. Yeah, you can't do that. You got to keep them all separate. So yeah, you'll have to go back and redo that part. Trying to get these spaced out just right. And then once you get that worked out, you know, the way you want it, then you can just copy and paste these frames again and reverse the order. Sometimes it leaves you with some extra frames, which always kind of drives me crazy, but that's okay. You can just clean that up by selecting the extra frames that you don't need, control click, and remove frames, and that brings them closer together. All right. So that is it for today's demonstration. Does anybody have any questions? What y'all think about today's demonstration? Did you learn some new stuff? Did you enjoy it? Yeah? Good. All right. So on next Tuesday, we are going to continue exploring frame by frame animation. And I'm going to introduce you to some other frames that are really useful to work with. Blank keyframes and regular frames. So we will explore all of the different aspects of what it takes to create a frame by frame animation and all the tools and capabilities involved in that process. And then we should be able to wrap things up and get started on our second assignment, or our first assignment for Unit 2, our second assignment for the class. All right? So some of you I'll see in the next class, and some of you I will see next week. Have a safe weekend if you're done for the day. And that's it.